Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again. As always, this is, I think, our 8th week of the speaker series. We have at least 2 more sessions planned. We have Sarah Dubois speaking next week about the International Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control, which is something I think that will be incredibly interesting and very relative, pertinent to this project. And then the week after, we're still hoping to get Tara Martin in to speak about deer management in the Southern Gulf Islands. But for today, we are joined by XELOSEWET's Tiffany Joseph, and I will let Bea introduce her in just a second. Before that, we will go through all the regular stuff. So as always, you guys are going to be muted for the duration of the presentation. You are welcome to type questions, comments, anything in the chat as we're going. And at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up to questions. So at that point, you guys will be able to unmute and ask questions if you like. We will be recording the session as usual, so you are welcome to keep videos off if you want to, stay private. That's completely okay. Even if you're speaking at the end, feel free to keep your video off. That works for us. I think that's everything for the technical stuff that I normally go through. So I will do a land acknowledgement as usual. So I am joining from the traditional territories of the Saanich people. I'm here in Sydney. And if anyone is joining from a region outside of the traditional territories of the Saanich people, I welcome you to take a moment to think about whose traditional territory you're on and think about what it means to really honor that and to be respectful and to incorporate that into your day-to-day lives in some way, to really honor the landscape and the people who have been on this landscape and are still on this landscape and will continue to be on this landscape, hopefully for time immemorial as well. I think that's everything. Sorry, I'm a little scattered. I spilled coffee all over my work desk like 5 minutes before this presentation, so I'm a little in a tizzy. So I think I will wrap it up and pass it over to Bea to introduce our speaker today.
Yes, thank you for being here today. And I will now introduce our speaker, and hopefully she will then maybe share a prayer or a welcoming to open this this talk today. So we have today, I tried all morning, it's still not coming. XELOSEWET, Tiffany Joseph. She is a GIS planner and coordinator at the Saanich Leadership Council. This mapping position falls within the Marine Use Planning Initiative, and it's an initiative underway with the Saanich Leadership Council. She's a member of the WLC Technical Advisory Committee, and she provides environmental input to this group. She joined the project this year, and she's part of the vegetation working groups with 2 others, members of the Saanich community. Oh man, Tiffany, it's so hard for me. She's a Sen Xuanthon language speaker and language holder, and we are really honored to have you here. I was telling Tiffany how that seems to me going back as a child trying to learn Yiddish from my father, which has definitely not worked well with me. I am still struggling with it. And she has a really interesting education, mostly in ecological restoration through the SINDEC Resilient Project as well. Thank you for being here with us, Stephanie. And I love to apologize about having slaughtered your language so abruptly. So please, the floor is yours.
Eis Gweitchel Helash XELOSEWET and a snet qualquel thamat thinatain kiam to the main tui chala chapla iat schala nost iat squatzito to the sociala. Tichum. Good day, everyone. The reason I got emotional is because, sorry, this is my first time introducing myself after my grandma passed away. And she's 92 years old, and I usually introduce myself saying my parents' and grandparents' names. And in my culture, we don't say their names after they've recently passed. But I'm very grateful to be here today, and grateful to my grandparents who lived here their entire lives. My grandma lived here basically since she married my grandfather, and she was just well known, well respected as a teacher. And I often say that what she did in her one lifetime, her daughters and granddaughters, but I can't help but be more biased towards what women in our family have done and continue to do. But I should acknowledge also my uncles and my male cousins. But what we've all done in our collective lives honestly seems like what she did in her one life. And I'm here to talk about Skuthamen, and I was just having a little bit of a hard time trying to figure out how I can present this in a way where I can see you all a little bit, even though your cameras are off and things like that, but also share my presentation with you. So I'm just gonna try and share the PDF version of my talk here for you today. So I'm just gonna share my screen. And while I'm sharing that, just with the emotions that I have, I'll usually say a prayer with words, but I'm just gonna say a prayer with song instead, and I'll sing two songs. The first song, I won't need a drum, and the second one, I also won't need a drum. The first one is the Saanich 13 Moon song, and then the second one I'll sing is Huwalish, and then I'll explain the significance of them after I sing them. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Ngingana wachas pachsi sang oh hey. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Schweinel panachwang chinthaki oh hey. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Chin hanin, chin thewin, chin quatloch oh hey. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Pakalenoch, Chwasalenoch, Stelkwe sang oh hey. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Seesat the sail of gelch. Cheech at the stallinung. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Abenug slew Saanich skelch. Chwalish, hoya ho, hoya ho, hoya ho he. Chwalish, hoya ho, hoya ho, hoya ho he. Nalqa miuk, nalqa chiuk, nalpa huiuk, hoya ho, ya ho ho, ho ya ho 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 he. Hualish, 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 ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho 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 he. Nalquamiuk, nalpahuiuk, nalkahiuk, ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho 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 he. Ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho ho, ho ya ho 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 he. Hi, Skahela. The first song was the Saanich 13 Moon song, and in it I acknowledged every single moon that we have in the 13 moon cycle. We're currently in Paxisang. It means the blossoming out moon, and it's also when all the flowers start to bloom. People always get excited, even if you know, I see it in. Sorry, is your name B? Okay, I see it in B getting excited about the weather. I feel it very often. It's when I start waking up even earlier than I normally wake up, and it's a little bit annoying because I want to sleep, but the energy doesn't seem to allow for that. And the days are getting longer, temperatures getting warmer. Really, the flowers are blooming. The moon before this was Wajas, which is the frog moon, and that's when the frogs started to croak. If you live near chorus frogs, you were probably starting to hear them at the beginning of the last moon. And the moon before that was Ngingana, which is the Saanich new moon, and Ngingana relates to the moon. It's the moon of the child, and the moon before that is Sisit, which is the elder moon. And so Sisit is the time where our elders would be sharing stories with us, and Ngingana is the time where children would repeat those back. And Sisit, being the elder, is the end of a cycle. Ngingana, moon of the child, is the beginning of a cycle. And it shows you really can't end a cycle without passing on those things that you need to start anew. It cannot be broken. There is no end. It's just an intertwining. And I'm just gonna go to the next slide here. It's just a continuation of what I'm saying. We're always taught to start everything with a prayer, and songs do include prayer in our culture, which is why I started that way. It helps us ground ourselves, so I was praying and asking for grounding, and honestly, even just being in the action of doing that is helping me ground. And the song that I sung is Huhulish, and many of our bird names do reflect reflect the sound that a bird makes. I'm just going to take a drink of water. And we're getting close to the time that Huhulish comes to our territory. And I want, if people can sort of play a game with me, I guess you could say. And I'm going to try and do my best to have this word reflect the sound of the bird. But if people aren't getting it by me singing the bird's name, I'll start whistling what sounds like the bird, how I think the bird sounds. So the bird sounds like Huhulish, 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 Huhulish. Huhulish, 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 Huhulish. Huhulish, 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 Huhulish. yes, use the chat to tell us the bird. But I liked, when I was a kid, I liked to whistle it, so I was like really happy when I heard in Sinchothan. Yeah, it's the thrush, Swainson's thrush. Yeah. So thanks for sparing me from having to whistle it, but I did like to used to whistle it when I was a kid, and I still do it as a teaching tool. But that bird brings the berries, brings the color to our berries. Right now they're kind of just, a lot of them are green. But when the Swainson's thrush arrives to our territory, it's bringing the colors of those berries. So that song says, Nulqa miuk, which means make them red, Nulqa hiuk, which means make them black, and Nulpa huyuk, which means make them blonde. If you think of the orange salmon berries, or even the little hairs that grow on them, that's what it's talking about. And this is a old song in our culture, and it's one that is recorded in Saanich ethnobotany. That Cecilia, who shared a pre-recorded talk last week, her mother shared that song with Nancy Turner. But it's a song that existed for a very, very long time. And you know, there's other birds like anga and squatot. That one, I think, if you think about it, the sound kind of gives you a hint of what that bird is, squatot. And it's kind of funny because in one of our reserves, my late cousin, he was my oldest cousin, he died of leukemia. He would have a laugh that the birds would say, it kind of sound like they're saying, awa, awa. But did any guess what the squatot is? Squatot is the raven. Yeah. And tseeked. That's a bird. That's a bird as well. Tseeked. I forget which one that is, but it's just I have neighbors, our neighbors, the Lekwungen speaking people, they say tsooked. It's I forget right now, but I'll remember later which one that one is. But I do find the hummingbird does make that sound, but it's not hummingbird. But I would like you all to know, have an idea of what our territory is. I don't have all the names here just because I'm going to be sharing a version of this with on another presentation coming up, and I didn't want to share something that I'm not allowed to share without permission from our leadership. But this is a capture of our territory based on place names that are shared with me as a mapper. And there will be another map asserting our territory. There already exists one on Saanich.com if you want to see another map. But there's just lots of work to continue to do. But our territory is, you know, you can see a lot of our territories in the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem. And it's not named on here, but also the Garryoke ecosystem. And those kind of go side by side. You know, with the environment, nothing is like cut and dry. It's not going to be exactly the same, but they tend to run alongside one another. But here's another map of the Camas distribution, or not Camas, sorry, Garryoke distribution. And you can see this goes all the way down to California. And I would say that as Saanich peoples, it wouldn't be odd for us to have gone down to California. We have people who shared their history their ancestors in our territory or in our nation, going all the way up to Alaska, all the way to Hawaii. And it's important to understand that a very strong tie to our land and our territory is people's ancestral names. So I don't have an ancestral name that's called a Kshamin. I have a Ninatmin. So XELOSELWET is a Sinchothan name, but it's one that was created for me, and it translates to camera lady because I've trained in photography and videography, and I've made many videos since I received that name because I was like, oh, now I have to live up to it. But I think even the mapping relates to it because the root in that name is chal, which means to mark. And it comes from chalasung, which is the word for camera, and alwet is a feminine determiner in a name. But this ecosystem that we're all living in, and even if we went down to Washington and Oregon, we'd still be living there. And if we went up to Nanaimo and things like that, we'd still be living in this ecosystem. And if we went down to California, we'd still find these relatives down there. This whole ecosystem really started to thrive when our ancestors started practicing the controlled burns, and it really wouldn't exist as it has been existing for I think the pollen research into how far back these burns go is 13,000 years or something like that, 10,000 years. And it wouldn't exist if we hadn't started doing those burns. The scientists would say we noticed that wildfires had an effect on the land, and we observed that and learned from that and started doing it in a prescribed way. And there's many benefits from the fires being done in a prescribed way. Avoiding wildfire being a danger to human occupation of land. Also, even for all the other life who would be afraid of a fire. When animals sense danger, they have to flee. They get adrenaline and they run. And even if they didn't die from a fire, they could die from like a heart attack and things like that. And things like that still happen to animals today. Like Banff in BC, Banff recently switched to using noiseless fireworks for their tourism because research showed that animals would die of heart attacks because they'd be running away from these big booms in the sky. So even that practice of the controlled burns would be something that would be less terrifying for all the life that lived there. And the result was highly biodiverse, highly abundant ecosystem that was that fed every being that lived there, every human, every deer. We would have all been able to live here, and the deer wouldn't overgraze and the humans wouldn't overharvest. Everything was in balance. Settler journals of early arrival reflected that the biodiversity was such that butterflies could be seen when the end of their life came. There was several inches of bird die off on the beaches. The reason they die is because they fulfilled their lifespan. It's only a few days compared to our decades of life as human beings, so when they die off, reach the end of their lives, there was so much of them that there was 5 inches worth of butterflies floating on the water. And we had plenty of deer to harvest. We had plenty of elk to harvest. and we had plenty of medicines to harvest. Our elders would have said, you know, we would wanted for nothing in our territories. And I heard that on my Squamish, in my Squamish upbringing, as well as here in Saanich. And I hear it from all of our relatives in Liltwat and Humatsquium and Tsleil-Waututh and Coates, and like all throughout these territories, that's the people's reflection of the land. And it really wasn't that long ago. You know, I recently saw somebody post on Facebook that they had an aunt or a mother or something who caught a salmon. She had the record salmon in BC, and it was like something like 60 pounds or something. You know, salmon were, you could catch a salmon and throw it on your shoulder and it would be dragging on the ground. And it really wasn't that long ago. It wasn't like it was like my great grandparents who lived this. Early settlers and recent settlers knew this lifestyle as well. And taking us, disconnecting us from the stewardship of the land has led to not only much smaller salmon, but also drastically reduced populations. And so the forests are actually really important to deer and salmon. You know, it's their home. It's you know, we have to go and log their homes in order to build our homes. But they live there. They make beds for themselves there. Salmon have to swim through creeks, and they have to be in cool areas. They need the forest to keep the water cool enough for them. If the water is too warm, they'll die off. The reason why is because the oxygen levels get lower and lower. And salmon aren't the only one. It's also trout that are also quite sensitive to that. Fish that aren't, that I've observed, are stickleback. They could literally live in a puddle. They don't need much at all. They're just like, water, I'm good. But they're very tiny, and they're actually more like the fish that fish forage on. So very strong and resilient fish, but not highly edible to us as human beings. So we have a really great responsibility as people living in these places to recognize, you know, we're not just here for us. We're here. We have a responsibility to every being. That is Saanich laws, and to be a good, however this makes sense to you, whether it's how can I be a good ally to Saanich peoples living in their territories, or whether it's just how do I be a good human being, not even just a good human being, just like know how to be a human. To qualify it as good or bad is a bit strong. I think just how to be a human being. How do you live here and be contributing to balance? And I know that kind of it probably sounds strange, but you know, the people who were the earliest arrivers to Saanich territories, Squamish territory would be the Vancouver area, to the whole Western, what's determined as the Western Hemisphere. You know, they were people who were drinking a lot of alcohol, doing a lot of drugs, not eating very much food, and definitely not getting enough vitamin C in the process. And bringing along ideas that the ways that they can steal land from people is by suppressing women. You know, these are all ideas that people came here from. It wasn't like there was the first diplomats, peacekeepers that came along. It was the people who had those ways of being, and you know, they took people as slaves, and even took girls as wives, literal 12-year-old girls. Like yes, women too, but often girls, coming and also giving this alcohol to men and telling them to commit abuse to women so that the woman wouldn't feel equal to them. The idea of women having as much of a say as a man was offensive to the early arrivers. And that's what that to be able to steal land, those are the things they did to try and create those ideas, because they didn't want anyone to hold them accountable. And so that's why I say just to know how to be a human being, because those people, who had those ideas, they really didn't have an idea how to be a human being. They had the idea of how to be greedy and get everything that they could. So it isn't to say that every single person who came to our territory had those kind of ideas, but they definitely, most people would have lost touch of what it meant to be a human being in relation to not just every other human being, but also every other life in a territory, and how to be accountable and responsible. And so our territory, we have meadows, we have forests, we also have wetlands, and these are really important places. And I'm sorry I don't have photos of Sidney Island wetlands. I've been there once in my life, and I kind of wanted to be as present as possible. Maybe next time I'll have more photos, but the wetlands have skunk cabbage, and if you go out to the wetlands, you might see some of these out there. You may or may not. But skunk cabbage was used to help us serve food in our pit cooks. So you put down skunk cabbage and a layer of food, like say your seafood, more skunk cabbage, and then your like vegetables, and you cook your food in a pit, and then after it's cooked for a few hours, then you pull it all out, and then the food's ready for as many people as you want to feed. But it was also in our pit cooks, we cooked camas, and that requires 24 hours of cooking. So it's kind of like one of the original slow cookers was cooking camas, and camas was an incredibly nutritious food staple for us. It's something that would have been sort of something that would not have a lot of sugar in it. So it's kind of like a starch in that how we use starches today, like potatoes and rice, but it's really not, because it doesn't give such a sugar boost to our diets, to our bodies, I should say. So when we lost camas as a food staple and it got substituted with potatoes and rice, that really, really impacted our people. But that was sort of a digression from the skunk cabbage. It's not quite edible either, the skunk cabbage. You would have to be really starving, like to eat it. It was kind of more our platter, you could say. And the reason why I refer to fog here is because something really interesting about an occurrence in our territories is lichen. So I worked in Sneedquith, which is Todd Inlet, and there's massive lungwort there, and tons of old man's beard and witch's hair all over our trees and stuff like that. And to be able to for lichen to be able to be produced, it actually needs fog. The sunlight has to shine through this fog to be able to produce these little hairy lichens. And when I learned of that, I thought that was really cool and worth sharing, because if you get rid of certain habitats, those miracles, like it's not, but it is a miracle of the environment that humans can't quite reproduce. You know, you can't have a man-made system where lichen is going to form, and lichen is a determiner of a really healthy area. Actually, you need you need really good oxygen for lichen to form. So if there's lichen around your home, just know that it's a healthy place, and also there's enough fog for it to form. And so being in good relationship to the land, and also knowing what kind of ecosystems we're in and what peoples have been here since time immemorial. You know, you might want to know, what can I do to help? There's currently action happening on Sidney Island in regard to Smythe, or in regards to fallow deer. And I will say, you know, it's just, I think it's kind of funny that I'm having to talk about this today. I would think that somebody else might, but I guess it's me. What I want to say is that Smythe is very sacred to us. So that would be like the black-tailed deer, which is native to here. It's so sacred that the teaching that comes from it is that, you know, the deer is here to teach us to only take what you need, and never to hurt or kill anything or anyone just for the sake of killing it. You don't just kill for fun. Fallow deer were kind of brought here for fun in a way, you know. The way they ended up here is that they're brought here, I think, from England. They wanted to participate in hunting in a way that they were used to, and they really didn't take into consideration deer already lived here. I think maybe they like the deer because the fallow deer herd up. They're more social than solitary. So the black-tailed deer are solitary animals, and they also travel. They travel throughout the territory. I think seeing a deer swim is pretty cool. And they also would have had natural predators, right? And our people would hunt them. So people complain a lot about deer in our territory. And for me as a Saanich person, I'm like, well, you also complain about us hunting. And how does any of this make sense? You know, to me, I'm still waiting for it to make sense, but not wanting deer to eat your garden, but not wanting Indigenous people to kill the deer, and not wanting a fallow deer to be removed from a place, like, you know, there's a lot, I think, that deer can give you an opportunity to reflect upon why you have strong feelings about those things. And I am saying that because I really don't want anyone to project onto me their issues about deer, because, you know, balance is really important. And having really strong feelings about something that's harmful doesn't make sense to me. And it's also detrimental to animals themselves if they are becoming in high populations. And deer were never a problem for us as Saanich peoples. They never were. And I also want to acknowledge that deer are very smart. Hold on one sec. Hey, I'm just finishing up a talk. Thank you for the hug. But I need to finish, okay?
Hey, I'm trying to go back up there.
Okay, love you.
Love you.
Love you. So we have a place that is the place of the deer, and it's what's called Mount Work now. But we can't hunt there. What's there? A dump. What else is there? a park that was taken from, like, that's taken as parkland and taken from us to be able to hunt. What else is there? Residents who don't want us to hunt. But we've hunted there for thousands and thousands of years, and I know so many people who grew up hunting there. It was real, you know, like, how can we be told to stop doing something when we were just doing it? It doesn't make sense. And so by me saying supporting this, it comes from something very well thought out. You know, our dear relatives, Ingus, they're really closely related to us. We have a very deep relationship with them, and it's one that provides us so many teachings. And, you know, I'm speaking from, you know, acquiring a lot of information from my teachings, from what's going on the land. And I would never support something that I thought was just people dealing with things as a nuisance, which is something that the government has definitely done before. There's, what is it called? Basque Shark. I can't remember what it's called. But there's a shark. Absolutely no harm or threat to human life whatsoever. They're a filter fish. And yes, the basking shark. And the Canadian government put razor blades on their boats to wipe them out. It was, I think, the 60s or 50s. There was lots of those in Brentwood Bay, and they're gone. And that's because the Canadian government just didn't like them. They were big and scary. But were they really scary? They're a filter fish, and they wouldn't have hurt anybody. So, you know, I don't just go around saying, you know, it's a good idea to wipe something out. It's not something that I would ever do unless there was a good reason. And, you know, like I said, the black-tailed deer are solitary deer. They wouldn't gather up so much and wipe out a whole place, whereas the fallow deer do that. They were probably sort of influenced by the behavior of the English. You know, they might have been making them, breeding them in that way so that they could do that. It's something to consider. But you know, and there's lots of our people who don't want to participate in hunting these deer in the ways that it's been happening on Sidney Island for, you know, a lot of the reasons many of us would have. They don't want them to be penned up and to shoot them. You know, we know that when any animal is distressed when you kill them, that gives them an adrenaline boost, and then their meat doesn't taste good. I have a friend who killed rabbits for food. You know, they keep them and they kill them, so they have to like be really loving and gentle, and then break their neck really quickly so that adrenaline doesn't go through. You know, we can have our emotions about these things, but we have that privilege of being that way when our food can be processed for us and we don't have to ever face that, right? I think that's a reflection of our sensitivity as people who have been living off of grocery stores for a few decades and never having to butcher an animal for our own livelihood. And it's also important to remember it wasn't that long ago that our people were looked down on for eating deer. My grandma said, don't ever make fun of a poor white person because they're poorer than a poor Native person, because my grandma and grandpa had 15 children, so they were definitely not going to be well off. You know, they worked very hard, both for their 15 kids, but also kids of the community. And my grandpa was a fisherman, and he was a fisherman in a time when people didn't want to buy fish off of Indigenous people. They would refuse to, or pay below like the bare minimum that they could pay for the fish, you know, so they were really struggling in a lot of ways. But my grandma said, don't ever make fun of a white person who's poor, because we still have so much. And she knew that because they were able to live off the land. They grew their own food. My grandpa caught fish. He used to hunt until the PTSD of World War II made it so that gunshots were a trigger for him and he just couldn't do it anymore. But we've always valued all life, and you know, it's still too much for some people to be able to do that. But the way I see it when it comes to fallow deer and black-tailed deer is I think of it kind of like mucus. You know, if the world is a body and it has mucus in certain spots, some places supposed to be. So if you're a person who ever carried a child, you know that you have a mucus plug when you're pregnant that keeps the water in, that keeps your baby safe from the outside world. And that mucus is so, so important to the well-being of your baby. But if it's coming out of your nose and it's ending up all over your face, you don't want mucus there. It's a bad sign if it's there. You know, you have an infection of some kind. And you don't just leave mucus, snot all over your face, you wipe it up. And you also, if you see somebody with that, you're like, don't get your mucus or snot on me because that's gonna make me sick, right? And so that's what I think of when it comes to some invasive species of any kind, you know? People love invasive deer, they love invasive flowers. I'm like, but it's a good thing, it's a part of nature. Yes, mucus is a good part of nature, but it's also a problem and a representation of sickness when it's in another context. And fallow deer being in Saanich territory is a reflection of a sickness and not a reflection of health. And it's important to know that, you know, the way the landscape was, unaltered by things like blowing up the land, because, you know, I explained how we did alter land. We did prescribe burns, and those meadows were growing over time, you know, and we were like, camas, we can make so much camas if we do these controlled burns. And the landscape did change, but it was very, very gradually, for one. For two, we didn't blast anything. We didn't dig giant holes. But somebody did dig a giant hole, and a pond that was never on Sidney Island was formed, and therefore deer had an endless water supply that was always there, so the deer never had to leave. And they were able to be well hydrated enough to produce. They just were always, they had everything they kind of needed there. But the way the land was healthy is if the deer and also the people would move around, because we had winter and summer villages. You might have winter and summer homes, but no matter where we went, we took our home with us, actually. So actually, XELOSEWET, which is on Sidney Island, was one of our winter villages. And so that's where we would have had our winter ceremonies. And then they would have paddled across to maybe the San Juan Islands or something like that to go to their summer village. But there was different families in each one of those villages, and they would have had their different summer villages as well. And I wanted to share, though, about watersheds because, I mean, Sidney Island's a pretty small watershed, but if there's any creeks near your home, whatever you're doing does go into the creeks or even down to the beaches. So what we as Saanich people face is that our clam gardens, our clam beds where we harvest, they are contaminated in a lot of places. I think they're considered safe on the islands, but I'm sharing this because, or sorry, the Gulf Islands, because I'm sharing this because we'd love for them to stay that way. We'd love for them to stay uncontaminated. And the ways they become contaminated is like a big issue in Coles Bay on the Saanich Peninsula is that, you know, the testing that's been done that keeps that beach closed shows that 100% of the fecal matter in that beach is human fecal matter. And that comes from septic. That comes from septic that is not maintained to the standard that the CRD determines is safe. And they've been trying to do something about that since the 90s. And, you know, for those of us who were like alive in the 90s doesn't sound long ago, but that's 30 years, right? Sometimes we forget that the 90s was only 30 years ago, but we're in a whole new century, a whole new millennium, and that was 30 years ago. And so knowing what watershed you're a part of, you know, I'm sure you all live on Sidney Island because you want to feel connected to land and connected to nature. And knowing the watershed you're in and knowing the creeks and how your presence there is impacting all of that is one way to just have a broader understanding of your impact on land. But also you can share that with other people, right? Like once you start connecting that way, you know, a friend who lives on Vancouver Island, like, what watershed are you in? And, you know, what creeks are around your home? Like, what do you think of your car exhaust or oil that might be running off into this creek? Is that creek okay? It goes off into this beach. Like, is that beach okay? Do people harvest clams in that beach? Because even though there's many beach closures on the Saanich Peninsula, it honestly doesn't stop some of our relatives. They still go out and harvest. And so, you know, even though you personally might not be having an impact on the Saanich Peninsula, if you have friends who live on the Saanich Peninsula and you want the Saanich people to be able to harvest clams and not have contaminated foods, then share that with your friends. You know, the people are harvesting down on those beaches and your septic tank is out of date. Maybe you should do something about that, because 30 years of trying to get the CRD to do something hasn't worked yet, but I'm still trying to help my friends push for that. Another thing you can do, I'm sorry if I'm talking so long, but another thing you can do is plant for pollinators. And Amy, who's on the Zoom with us, she and I did the certified pollinator steward workshop. And you know, I think ever since I learned about bees, I haven't stopped talking about them. I see this post like probably once a year about how Europeans, when they kept hives, they would go tell it to the bees. So, you know, you go sit. So like, I just lost my grandma. So a person would go and start talking to the beehive and say everything that's going on, the problems within the community, the disagreements and the deaths, and they'd tell it to the bees. So if you're of, I think it's English, but could be other European ancestry, that's something that your ancestors did. But what my ancestors would have lived with were not honeybees. They don't live in like hives. They're solitary bees, like the solitary black tear. We have solitary bees in our territory, and solitary bees are very gentle. They'd have to be convinced you're going to kill them for them to sting you. Whereas like if you've been stung by a wasp, you know, they literally will hunt you and pursue you to sting you. Or if you've been stung by a honeybee, it's because you're close to their nest. And they just like perceive you as a threat. Whereas like solitary bee is just like, hey, like I'm doing my thing, you do your thing. Like I'm just pollinating this plant and I'm trying to gather some nectar. I got some babies I got to take care of. I'm just going to assume you don't have any ill will towards me because I don't have that towards you. And so I'm going to gather this pollen and then, you know, they're doing their thing and they'd be like, oh, you're getting closer to me. Why are you trying to hit me? I'm just going to try and get away from you. Why are you trying to hit me? And like, they still wouldn't sting you. They'd be just trying to get away from you. But if you were like, I'm going to squash you, that's when they'll sting you. Because like, no, I don't want to die. Like, you're not supposed to kill me. So those are the bees that are not only indigenous to Saanich territory, but all of North America. Those are the bees that come from here. And they don't take over a whole area, just like I described, like the solitary deer don't take over a whole area. Solitary bee doesn't take over a whole area because it's really just living its life for itself and its babies. And it's the female bee, that's here for itself and its babies, because the male bee is just like, I'm just here to mate with her, like, and I'll pollinate too, but I just want to mate with her and then just hang out on flowers. Like, if you see a bee sleeping on a flower, it's probably the male bee because he's just like, I'm just waiting. Versus, that queen bee who has all these like different bees working for her. It's pretty much smaller thing going on for the solitary bees. So if you plant for them, you're creating more of an environment that has that kind of energy where it's like, I'm just here to take care of these flowers and these babies, and that's all I'm going to do for my whole life. And they just, they need some flowers and they need water. And they need a mate once in a while, because if they don't mate, then they won't produce female eggs. Those eggs won't hatch into females. She'll just lay all males. So she does need a partner to help make some more females. A solitary bee can only forage 50 to 100 meters from their nest. Whereas the honeybee can go for miles and miles, So it's also really important because they can't pollinate tons of plants that aren't native. They need that sustenance, just like my people were suffering without camas as a staple in our diet, or salmon as being able to be a staple in our diet, and deer. We don't have those like 3 big staples in our diet, and our health is suffering. Same goes with the bees. They really need camas. They really need sea blush and snowberry. Snowberry is their second favorite. Camas is their first. And I think sea blush is their 4th favorite flower to pollinate. So the more biodiversity of native plants they have, the better, and also the connectivity. So if from what I saw at Sidney Island, you have huge lots, but for people who have smaller ones, you might have to go to your neighbor and be like, hey, I've got native plants here for the solitary bees. Could you also have native plants for the solitary bees? Because like, I'm worried if my bee friends go in your yard that they'll get trapped there and have nothing to pollinate. So if you do that, it would be helping me take care of bees. And then you can share with them exactly how I shared with you about bees. But I'm joking, but you can also look into more solitary bee information on pollinator.org. I've also written a story about Samsamaya, which is our word for bee. It's a curriculum. It's a curriculum in my head mostly, but it's everything I learned about the solitary bee and it's all captured in that story. But the story is kind of connects more obviously in a story manner, but also in a more emotional manner as well, which helps make it easy to connect, to remember and connect, but also ties to, the ways women had power and ability to make decisions in ways that women haven't in other cultures. It wasn't long ago, it would have been really hard for women to get divorces in non-Indigenous cultures, but it wasn't, women had that ability and power for themselves in our culture. So it's lots of different things are woven together in that story. And I can send it to Stephanie if anybody wants a copy of it. But that's my talk. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I was the one that asked you to speak about the deer, and I appreciate that you did. I know that's maybe not necessarily something that you would feel is the topic that you wanted to speak to, but I very much appreciate that you shared your perspective and your mucus metaphor, which I ended up really enjoying, though like Amy, I wasn't sure where it was going at first. I will open it, as always, to any questions that folks might have. You can drop them in the chat or click that little raised hand button there on the bottom, and we will unmute anyone who wants to ask a question. Though I should check in with you, Tiffany. Are you okay to spend a couple minutes with us? Do you have to run away anywhere?
I can maybe do one question, then I do have to run away somewhere.
Fantastic. Okay, we get one eager question.
And remember, if you have questions and we can answer, send them to us and we can connect with Tiffany and get back to you later on. So don't be shy if something doesn't pop up yet, we still have the opportunity to talk to Tiffany in a second moment. Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous and people saying, this was awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for sharing. So that's amazing.
Judith wants to mention, Tiffany, that Ken Poskett is working on getting a map to you, and he's sorry he couldn't be here today.
No worries.
So guys,
okay.
as usual, like I don't see any question popping, and I want for Stephanie to be able to go to her next meeting and have maybe sometimes to recover and to eat or drink or enjoy. And so I would say we can close it today here. As usual, Stephanie and I always hang a little bit here because you may have other questions and you want to talk to each other, and we love that a lot when you do so. So thank you so much for coming today, and especially in this lovely, beautiful day. And yes, Stephanie, I'm so excited about our next speaker to come. So please come the next couple of days, a couple of weeks for other speaker to come.
Yeah.